Oliver Cromwell and the Restoration of Israel. Israel is in the news and always will be. On May the 14th, 1948, Israel became a nation again. The dry bones of Ezekiel 37 lived again, and the old biblical nation that many had regarded as the stuff of storybooks was restored in a single day. Many people saw this as a fruit of the Zionist movement among the Jewish people who had gained the support of evangelical Christians. However, in many ways, it was the other way round. Protestant Christians, particularly in the 17th century, who had rediscovered the Bible, had themselves discovered the verses about the restoration of Israel and had themselves influenced the Jewish people and given them the belief that the restoration of their homeland was a real hope, not just a dream. England was in turmoil for most of the 17th century, and at the root of this turmoil was the fact that the Bible had become available in English to ordinary people. In particular, the 1611 Authorized Version, which is now usually known as the King James Version, became widely available and was revered as the Word of God. People no longer took the teachings of the institutional church at face value, but studied the scriptures for themselves. As a result, a huge number of religious groups sprang up, many concerned with eschatology and the return of Christ. There was an increased interest in Jewish people and the promises made to them in the Bible. The Jews had been expelled from England in 1290 in the reign of King Edward I. Many Protestants, including Oliver Cromwell, now believed that the conversion of the Jews to Christianity was essential before Christ would return to reign on earth. Even before Cromwell, a movement had started in England for the readmission of the Jews. In part, this was because many believers had realized that the promises God made to the Jews were eternal. The church had taught that all God's promises to the Jews had been appropriated by the church and no longer applied to the Jews. People started to question this argument on the basis that God is not a man that he should lie, Numbers 23:19. In 1621, Henry Finch published his work, The World's Great Restoration, or Calling of the Jews and with them of all nations and kingdoms of the earth to the faith of Christ. In this work, Finch ascribed the writing of the Hebrew prophets to the Jews themselves rather than to the church in general. He thus started the process of restoring the Jews' own Bible back to them. Unfortunately for Finch, he incurred the wrath of King James I by predicting the restoration of the Jews to worldwide dominion. James saw this as seditious and demanded that Finch recant on some of what he had said. Despite this, the door was now open for believers to understand that God would never break his promises to the Jewish people, and the admissionist movement was born, whereby many Protestants in England called for the readmission of Jews to England. At the end of 1653, Cromwell became the Lord Protector of what was known officially as the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland. He was then in a position to act on petitions on behalf of Jewish people who wished to be allowed back into the country. A man called Manasseh ben Israel became instrumental at this point. He had been born in Lisbon in 1604, settled in Amsterdam, and became a rabbi. In 1651, he had petitioned Cromwell to allow Jewish communities to be re-established in England. He believed this would hasten the coming of the Jewish Messiah. In September 1655, he arrived in London with a delegation and personally petitioned Cromwell for the readmission of the Jews. Cromwell met with him, and it was agreed that a conference should be convened to discuss the issues. The petition requested such things as citizenship, freedom of worship, burial grounds, freedom to trade, and the withdrawal of all laws against Jews. Cromwell had been attempting to introduce a greater degree of religious liberty in England. The 1653 Instrument of Government had been the first detailed written constitution adopted by a modern state. Articles 35 to 37 gave greater religious freedom to all Protestant groups, at least. In December 1655, the conference met a number of times. Although there was no formal outcome, it became clear that the Jews would again be tolerated in England. In 1656, Cromwell made a verbal promise, backed by the Council of State, to allow Jews to return to Britain and practice their faith freely. From this time, the Jews started returning to England, but it wasn't until 1858 that the Jewish people received formal emancipation. So the long process of the restoration of the Jewish people had begun. The oppressions and cruelties which had been visited upon the Jewish people for many centuries began to diminish. They did not cease, but they steadily decreased in number and in intensity. If you are interested in this subject, I highly recommend Gratan Guinness's Light for the Last Days, published in 1886. This book gives an overview of the terrible sufferings undergone by the Jewish people since their exile from their homeland. It also gives details of their gradual restoration from the 17th century onwards. So, thank you for listening. If you found this video interesting, you can find more information at prophecy-workshop.com.